So my name's Justin. I'm the manager of Little Shop of Stories, which is a kids bookstore in Decatur, Georgia. I need to thank a few folks before we begin. So I'm just going to go ahead and I want to make sure that we thank our conference sponsors. So please, this panel and New Voices, New Rooms would not be possible without conference sponsors HarperCollins, Blackstone, Sourcebooks, Scholastic, Simon & Schuster, Penguin Random House, and Ingram. We are so appreciative of them being able to support conferences like this and keep these great conversations going even through a pandemic. So I certainly want to welcome you all to this Mindful Books for Anxious Kids panel. We have a great slate of authors, and I'm real excited to hear what they have to say, I think it's going to be a really great conversation. So I'll go ahead and introduce each of them, and then I'll sort of turn it over to them one at a time to talk about their books for a little bit, and then they'll engage in what I think will be a really fantastic conversation about the topic. So first, sorry, I've got to look at my notes for everybody's biography, but in alphabetical order, Leslie Davenport is a marriage and family therapist who brings 30 years of clinical experience to the emerging field of climate psychology. She works as an educator and consultant to institutes recognizing the benefits of behavioral research for cultural shifts and policy change. She's the author of 3 previous books, including Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change. And Leslie has worked at Ground Zero on disaster mental health teams and is on faculty with the California Institute of Integral Studies. She has offices in Tacoma, Washington, and in the San Francisco Bay Area. Today is her book birthday, so we're very excited that All the Feelings Under the Sun is out today. Kay Ibura was born as the middle child in a family of 7, 5 kids plus parents, in New Orleans, Louisiana. When they weren't disagreeing about everything, Kay Ibura and her siblings played competitive rounds of jacks and a card game called Crazy Eights. They also built insane obstacle courses throughout the house involving stacked chairs, sheets, and timers. Her parents were independent thinkers who filled the home with music, culture, and strong principles. Today, she lives in Brooklyn, where she makes art, writes, and does puzzles while her daughter cheers her on. And Irene Latham. Irene lives on a lake in rural Alabama and is the author of hundreds of poems and nearly 20 poetry, fiction, and picture books, including Dictionary for a Better World, Can I Touch Your Hair, and Don't Feed the Boy. Her books have been recognized on state lists and honored by NEA, ALA, NCTE, SEBA, Junior Library Guild, Bank Street College, and other organizations. And finally, Mechal Roe. She is a New York Times #1 best-selling illustrator and a writer, designer, photographer, and entrepreneur. The Happy Hair series was born out of a need to value her own natural hair while creating a foundation of self-love and positivity. And she currently lives in Atlanta, so makes you a neighbor of mine. I'd like to begin with you, Irene, with your book Wild Peace. It comes out next month, has an October laydown, and I wanted to ask you, this picture book, the illustrations are beautiful, and it has these wonderful quiet moments that I think speak to this idea of books for anxious kids. In what way do you think do picture books that might not have been thought of in these terms now might speak to issues of anxiety in kids?
Yeah, it's a great question, Justin. Here is the book for those of you who haven't seen it, and the illustrator is Il-Sung Na. And I sold this book a number of years ago. I mean, we waited for Il-Sung to have time on his schedule to illustrate it. So it is interesting it coming out now at a time when I think that we are much more aware about children's anxieties, human anxieties. We've had, of course, the huge experience that we all know with COVID. So I, as a child, Kay, you and I are the same in that I'm the middle child of 5 kids that had a big, crazy life, growing up with all these siblings. And so the book for me was about where I found comfort. I'm an introvert. So for me to be growing up in that family, there were some difficult moments. And I found comfort in 2 places reliably, and that was in nature and in poetry. And so this was kind of a way to marry both of those things. So the book is just 150 words. It's a long poem, and it is just about these quiet moments of a child discovering peace from the animals in the forest. And Ilsung brought an amazing narrative to the book that I could not have imagined. And where this child, the end papers open with this child drawing on the wall, and so she's got a little stuffed fox, and so there's a question in the book: is this imagination? Has this child escaped into her imagination, or has this child actually gone into the woods? Which is something I really love about the book as well. And imagination is another great tool for dealing, with anxiety and during tough times. So I'm not sure how well I answered that question, Justin, but those were just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, no, and it's a beautiful book, and I love the moment that that the child sort of leaps into the drawing on the wall and starts this journey. I think is a really beautiful moment. Mechal, I want to switch to you. Thank you, Irene, for talking about your book. I'm Growing Great is another picture book. It's laid down as January 4th. This is a follow-up to Happy Hair, which was such an amazing title. We loved it here at the shop the moment we saw it. This book, like Happy Hair, and I think kind of a through line through all your work that I've seen, is kind of about creating a sense of self-esteem for girls, particularly girls of color. And I'm wondering if you sort of see self-esteem as a way of inoculating against all the kind of anxiety that the world can impose upon kids as they're bumping up against things in the world.
Absolutely, that's a great question, Justin. And I just want to, before I go into that question, I too am a middle child, so I don't know if this was sort of like a setup for some. You are too? Okay. I mean, middle children of the world unite. So this is the book as well. It's I'm Growing Great. And just to speak to your question, Justin, I think creating a sense of self-esteem in who you are in an early age is so important in having confidence to go out into the world and live out your purpose. And I just wanted to bounce off of Happy Hair, where it was more about outward appearance and accepting the hair that you grow. But in Growing Great, likening our inner self to a garden, how we can prune, how we need to water, how we need to grow, just so we can be prepared for the challenges of the day. Because just because you pruned one week doesn't mean you don't need to go back. You always have to kind of go back and take care of yourself in different ways so you can be prepared and grow for different challenges.
Yeah, that's really great. I love that and Leslie, when we talk to you, you might be able to speak to this more specifically, but how nature as this kind of through line for finding a sense of inner security or inner peace or connectedness is kind of along here, along with this middle child thing. I'm really excited for your book, When the World Turned Upside Down. It's a middle grade book, also coming out January 4th. It is about some kids who find themselves isolated in quarantine during the pandemic. And I think it's really amazing how, you showed that these kids find that they're not as isolated as they they thought they were, and that through their connections in this apartment building, they're kind of. It seems in a way that there's a call to action here, and I'm wondering. It seems like that there's an argument maybe being made in which cooperation and community are ways in which we push against those anxieties that we can encounter in the world. And I mean, hopefully that's not a misread. I'm wondering if you might speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I think for sure cooperation and community is the space where they were able to push against anxieties. I think one of the things that I was looking at in the book is that one of the character has chronic anxiety, but all of them, obviously, all of us have been dealing with anxiety around our whole lives being turned upside down. And it was interesting to me. I had one character who I didn't understand very well. All the characters came to me fully formed, but one of them I wasn't so close to and I didn't understand. And then I realized he himself had anxiety about things changing and wanted things to remain the same, and he was exerting control. He doesn't, this is Ben, he doesn't have chronic anxiety like Liam, who anxiety can sort of take over and physically take over his body and cause him to stop. But I realized that all the characters were dealing with some level of it. And by extension, by me delving into that, I realized that we all are, and there's this sort of spectrum of anxiety that we're all sort of managing. And there's some people who have this chronic level of anxiety who have to learn deep coping techniques so that they're not stopped. But we all have to learn some kind of way to deal with all of this pressure and all of these changes. And really what drew me into writing the book was thinking about the fact that as adults, we all know what we went through with the pandemic. But at a certain point, I was like, oh my God, kids went through all these things too. And we couldn't shelter them in the ways that we can shelter them from certain adult challenges. They kind of were right there on the front lines with us. And I really wanted to look at the ways that they were kind of managing something that adults hadn't figured out yet. So I learned a lot just by writing the book and taking that journey. And I really like the fact that Liam, he did not stop having anxiety, but he was encouraged to face it and encouraged to use some of his coping challenges because of the draw of community, because he wanted to be a contribution, because he wanted to help his mom. There were all these different sort of personal connection moments that really supported him. His friends supported him, and they always did, even before the pandemic, but also he felt encouraged to kind of find new ways to cope. And I think that was important to me to say that we can find strength in community. It doesn't disappear our challenges. It doesn't make things go away, but through those connections, we can learn how to face it and maybe find new strategies and work together to kind of make things sustainable.
I'm really looking forward to your book. It feels like it is going to speak going forward to many kids, not just in terms of pandemic, but kind of just kind of be one of those wonderful books that people return to just because it's wonderful and speaks to all the kids struggle and finding community. And anyway, I'm very excited for it. I think also the way you were talking about not being able to shelter kids from things that we wrestle with as adults, and I think that Leslie, your book really kind of lays that bare. So it's it's nonfiction. I didn't see it listed, but I get the impression that it's for the middle grade reader, but it could be used as a tool maybe more broadly. I'd love for you to talk about how your book takes this really enormous topic of in looking at the climate crisis and kids wrestling with all of its implications, including the anxiety that induces, and the way that your book, I just thought it was wonderful the way that you not just use graphics and different fonts for the exercises, but the way they come at a moment that is, you start to inform the reader, and then there's almost a way in which, at a moment at which it starts to create some anxiety, you'll introduce an exercise, a breathing exercise or a thought exercise that helps you kind of take a break and digest what's on the page and what's overwhelming about the world. And I should say, again, your book, All the Feelings Under the Sun, today is the book birthday for this book. Anyway, I'll go ahead and let you speak to it.
Thank you so much. And I am happy to be celebrating the launch with all of you today. Well, you know, you're really speaking to the underlying structure of the book, that there's sort of a method to the madness of the structure. And as you said, it takes vetted climate science, put into child-friendly language, paired with tools and exercises and practices that build emotional intelligence, emotional resiliency, and it intentionally toggles back and forth. And that actually comes out of some things we understand about our nervous system and the brain through trauma studies. That, and I will say, as we sort of implied, we could actually all use this as adults too. We get bombarded with lots of news and lots of distressing news, and we don't know where to go with it and what to do with it. And that the range of feelings that arise are a really natural response. You know, if you care, if you're paying attention, if you're noticing what happens, we're going to feel upset. We're going to be frightened. We're going to be sad. We're going to be frustrated. And so what do we do with that? And that's exactly what the book is about, is to be very real and eyes open about introducing climate science right along there with these very practical tools for coping, which span a really broad array of ways of approaching it. There's art, there's mindfulness, there's journaling, there's ways to reach out. So I like to think of it as what I call internal strategies, all these ways to be with the feelings, and external strategies, how to build community, how to reach out, how to feel and become part of meaningful change. And really looking at things like social justice issues can't be separated from addressing climate change. So it's a very layered book in that way. You're right, it covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, when I was first looking through it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. But then when I started to read the introduction and everything, I just thought it was really smartly patterned. And I love the little, and you also had biographies, which also help sort of speak to kind of not being alone. I mean, you start with Greta Thunberg, which I thought was really great. The other thing that occurred to me, like as I was talking about this, I was overwhelmed, and your book helped me kind of process it. And I'm wondering if each of you wants to talk about, I have this theory as a bookseller that oftentimes kids' books, particularly picture books, are as much lessons for the adults that are reading them to their children as they are lessons for kids. You know, kids, I think, read and absorb things in a much more kind of organic way, in which they kind of read and process in ways that they aren't necessarily conscious or self-conscious of, and it's sort of more natural. Whereas like I, as an adult, I'm reading something and I'm like, oh, there's something I can draw from this. And and I was wondering, you know, Kay, you spoke to some ways in which at writing this, you were digesting, you know, absorbing some of the ways in which we understand the pandemic. And I thought maybe it might be an interesting way to kick off the conversation, to talk about the ways in which your books speak to people of all ages, and the ways in which I often hear writers talk about that, you know, there is much writing for themselves now and the child they were as they are, you know, writing for kids out there in the world. I don't know, is that something that echoes true for any of you?
Yeah, I'd love to kind of speak to that. Well, when I wrote Happy Hair, I wrote it to speak to the younger version of myself and accept the hair that I grew. But I think as I become adult, you think that you separate yourself from your younger version, but your younger version of you is still in there experiencing all that adult trauma. What I like to say anxiety comes from little heartbreaks over and over. just not processed in a way that your younger self can understand. And when I was writing I'm Growing Great, I think I was speaking to myself and my younger self. I think sometimes we feel like picture books need to be super complicated, but we can understand like simple words, we can understand simple ideas. And sometimes our younger self comes into our adult version of ourselves and just starts causing havoc. And you literally have to reparent yourself, sit yourself down and say, hey, look, I have stuff to do, you know. And I think 2020 was jarring for the entire world. You know, we were having little heartbreaks everywhere and new insecurities and things that we thought we buried kind of bubbled up. And now we're confronted with those issues in our apartment, our homes. And I think I'm Growing Great, it's like I said, can be in a book for adults as well, to go back and remember those things, those simple ideas that grounded us when we were younger.
I love picture books. I love the way that they can encapsulate such profound emotions and such big thoughts in such simple and beautiful ways. And one of my things that I struggle with as an adult is reading. I can't read as much as I did before. I used to be a voracious reader. And now it's just like we have these little cell phones, these little distraction machines, I have the exhaustion and the weight of the world on my back, you know. And more often than not, when I go to the bookstore, I'm finding myself reading and looking at children's books. And it's opens a window to worlds of people who maybe I don't have the same experiences as them, but also makes me reflect on different sort of emotions and how I process them. So I just love sort of what they can do. One day, maybe I'll be able to write one. For someone who writes long form, children's books are a bit challenging, you know, because there's a certain level of mastery to get so much depth in, you know, such short period of time. But I love that. I love the question and the answer. But one of the hopes I also have with my book is that parents, if they're reading it with their kids or before they give it to their kids or whatever, that they wonder what their kid went through. And, you know, maybe if they didn't have as thorough conversations as they may have had, that they go back and say, did you feel this way? Did you notice, you know, how I was feeling? And did that hurt you or scare you? Or, you know, that the idea that these kids are going through this whole world. And, you know, I know things are different with this generation. When I was younger, and, you know, my generation, there was a separation between parents and children in a way that there's much more sort of like, you know, I'm way more involved in my daughter's life than my mom was involved in my life, you know. But still, I still think that there's opportunities to kind of reflect on what experiences children may have had that you may not have thought of, and a way to kind of go back and have a little touch point with them and try to connect and learn, you know, what these past years have been like for the kids.
Yeah, I think, you know, picture books allow that opportunity for that conversation. I mean, my earliest memories are of sitting on my dad's knee and him, you know, reading poetry to me. And I remember doing that, of course, with my children as well. And I think a big thing for me is I read a lot on both sides, on the children's side and the adult side. And a lot of poetry I read, I wish I could give to the kids, you know. In fact, I would love to share with you guys just a few lines from the poem that actually inspired Wild Peace. It's a poem called The Peace of All Wild Things by Wendell Berry, which some of you may have heard. It's a gorgeous poem. I'll just read the end of it for you. He says, I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. And so to me, you know, when you have those kind of words and a way to, you know, then you have a conversation, you know, with the child about what does it mean to be free of those anxieties? And, you know, how do you see that happening in the world? How can that happen for you? So to me, picture books are just like, great, just like what everyone's saying for all ages. Bring them on. I love picture books. So,
But yeah, I was just going to say one of the things that came up for me about the child to adult relationship is, you know, we tend to think of kids as learning as they go, and then as adults we've got it figured out. let's just dispel that myth right away. You know, we're all on this arc of a learning curve. And I think when it comes to climate change in particular, that's especially true. Because as some of you were saying, you know, the kids today are facing a very different kind of world. I'll mention real quickly, there was a big landmark study just came out 2 weeks ago that interviewed 10,000 youth from 10 countries. And in the US, 68% of kids said they are frightened about their future. It was higher on a global level, and that almost half said that on a daily basis, they were dealing with feelings related to climate change. And in some instances, kids are more tuned in than the older generations. And as they start to study, well, how did climate change occur? It brings up generational questions. How did we get here? And so in this topic in particular, it's so valuable to approach it as a family focus. And this book does encourage that too.
I have 2 teenagers, and I'm kind of blown away at how cynical they are. But they're also, you know, very kind of frank about the ways that they're looking forward, you know, at some of the things that are coming. One of the things, Kay, that occurred to me is that your book can also speak across generations, that kids who experience the, you know, the pandemic have this book that they can share in the future with, you know, with their kids or nieces or nephews or grandchildren about what they went through. The thing. Oh, I know, Mechal, you were talking about how you use nature in. Do you mind holding up the cover again?
Sure.
Because it's really great. It's fantastic. I just love that face.
Thank
It's
you.
just such a wonderful face. But that you
Thank
use
you.
the elements of nature almost as a metaphor for kind of pruning ourself, and I think that so many of these elements of nature that crop up, Leslie, you speak to in terms of right at the beginning, you say you are a part of nature. And so I think that like all of this, you know, in Kay, you talking about how you're not isolated, you're part of a community, is all of this speaking to kids saying that they're not alone. And also that I think that one of the things that says is that this issue is not out there, but something that is also I'm connected to, and so maybe I can change or do something about. I don't know if that's at least that's something that I saw in there, and I don't know if you guys want to talk about at all like how you see your kids, the characters in your books, or like kids in the world interacting with your books, finding those kind of connections.
Can I, I'll just speak to that really quickly. When, just for an example, when I moved into my apartment, my sister said, buy a plant, take care of that plant. And I mean, I've been taking care of that plant as if it's myself. So if that plant is a little dry, leaves are falling off, I'm like, have I been drinking enough water? Have I been getting enough sunlight? And I feel like that plant in my apartment, I wish I could bring it over here, you'll see why. But it's a metaphor for definitely how I take care of myself. And then sometimes when you have gardens, you have different kinds of flowers. You can't just, in the same way, just focus on one thing in your life, just like your career. You know, you have to think about your family or your friends. It all works together to keep a balance. And I just really like that metaphor in nature, or to keep us grounded, for sure.
I love that too, and I'm taking a master gardener class this fall, so I'm learning all this stuff about watering. And this is, I'll use this as a metaphor. One of the big things I learned in the class is that there's a big mistake that a lot of consumers make in planting plants in the wrong place. So it's always the right plant in the right place. And so in my particular yard, I have tons of shade, and I've been trying to grow these flowering plants. It's never going to work. And so I think it's really important, you know, for us as human beings to, to be in places where we will grow. Sometimes we don't have control over that. Sometimes we have to, eke our way out of the sidewalk or, whatever. But when we do have a choice, I think that's something to think about. Where do you thrive? And what environments do you thrive? And that's how I ended up at the lake. It wasn't the city anymore.
I'd love to add to that too. In the book, I talk about not only kind of the philosophical and poetic aspects of being part of nature, but that scientifically it's literally true that the water that comes out of our faucet is in fact the same water that's in our rivers and lakes, and kind of tracing the path of it, that the air we breathe, if we use a little bit of a different terminology, is sky, that our bones are built out of the minerals in the soil based on the food we eat. And so with this kind of visceral awareness about not being able to divide us from what we think of nature as out there, but part of it, it actually influences the choices we make and the relationship we have to the world. So it is kind of taking what's been expressed and adding kind of a science layer on it as well to shift a whole perception about that.
Yeah, I know for myself with anxiety, which is a little bit different from the nature conversation, but maybe not so much, is that I always remind myself that I'm not alone in whatever feeling I'm having or whatever stress I'm going through, that it's not unique to me. And I think it's somehow when we have issues with our self-esteem, anxiety, a layer of it, not the only layer, but an additional layer is the idea that something's wrong with us and that, there's something in us that's creating this thing. And it always helps me personally to remember that the glitches that I have are human. That's, human beings have disaster thinking, human beings, try to do it perfectly, even though they've never done it once before and have never practiced in their life, all the different things that could create anxiety, that it's a very human trait, and earlier, Justin, you mentioned, I think the social justice angle in your book, Leslie, and that's another piece that's in When the World Turned Upside Down, because obviously that was a huge part of year one of the pandemic, where these conversations, and part of that conversation happens across generations, happens across, what happens in a parent's generation, what happens in a child's generation, and the level of anxiety that different children have around sort of violence and the potential for these things to happen, and how kids can cope with or build a space for themselves in order to kind of wrestle with these questions, was another layer of how to get there. And I think what I had to do to kind of think about it was to read about what kids were writing about social justice, was to read books for children about social justice. And what does that really mean? Like, because all I have as a template is the past and what adults do, and to be able to find a space for the kids to authentically be themselves and still be in this conversation, not that they have to reach to be something. And that's a big lesson for one of the characters. It's like, she thinks she's not doing anything because, oh, I found the connection. I am connected to the theme that everyone's saying. Here it comes. She thinks that she's not doing enough because she's just a kid and they're just working in the building and they're just doing this thing in the building. And her mom tells her, but if you're trying to change the world, you are the world, and everyone in the building is the world. So that connection that we're talking about with nature, it is there because it's the connection with people. Like, we make up sort of the environment of community and humanity, and so that the things that we do have enough of an impact and an influence within our reach. And I think that's important for kids to know, and to not feel like, and for all of us adults too, to not feel like if we're not, lighting the sky on fire, we're not doing anything, but to be able to celebrate the influence of within our reach and what we can do to authentically use our voices and still be a part of, influencing change.
Yeah, I did not mean to make you feel. I thought that was one of the things that I saw there is the kids I mean, particularly, was it McCall? You were talking about being in the. No, Irene, you were saying being in the right place at the right time. I mean,
Hmm.
I think that one of the things that, particularly middle grade books, allow kids to do is see a space where they're able to have agency and imagine themselves as being um, connected. See, imagine that those real connections are made sort of alive in their imaginations through the connections that they see in the book
Yeah.
um, with their fellow friends and community. And the other thing that I think is really amazing is that you were talking about researching to find the language and the tools that kids were using to articulate their vision for and their action towards social justice, that then pays forward, right? So that the things, I mean, obviously, Leslie, your book is a manual for this, but in some ways also the picture books and the narratives that Kay and McCall and Irene that you guys have created also give kids
Hmm.
the language to articulate this into the world, which I think is really amazing.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to think of all of our books as blueprints for dealing with anxiety and dealing with
Hmm.
the wide world, you know?
And I'll also add, I found a connection with social justice and how, in 2020, we all went out in the streets and we fought for each other. And the same way we can fight for our emotional peace, our emotional stability, with that same fervor. And I just feel like we have this opportunity now with so many new changes and perspectives on mental health. I'll just say I was scared straight growing up. There weren't a lot of movies out there for mental health. It was kind of like One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Girl Interrupted. And that really so now we're coming into an environment where we can talk about it as normal and, we can all sometimes deviate from the track, but I'm really excited about what kids will have at their fingertips.
And related to this, just how even advocacy, as some of you are talking about this, can be redefined in really broad terms. If you're creative and an artist, how that can be a form of advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
You can be an advocate in the context of your school and start a green club. And, there's just so many avenues that are valid for finding a place and using our voice and using our gifts.
And I think also the way all of your books normalize a discussion of kids being able to articulate their way in the world, whether it's being able to talk about feeling anxious because of global events, like the pandemic, Kay, in your book, or being in the middle of chaos, Irene, like in your book, where if you're in a and if you're one kid in a house of many, that you need to be able to find your space, or even the importance, McCall, of seeing your face in the books that you
Oh, yeah.
read. I just think that all those things are very, very powerful, and I'm just really excited for each of these books and the way that I think that they're all going to be special to kids that discover them. I'm thrilled to be able to be a bookseller that's able to put them in kids' hands. We're drawing. We're still about 5 minutes off. Does anybody have anything else they want to add? Burning things they want to say?
I can't wait to buy all of your books.
Yeah, no kidding.
Same here. Same here.
And shout out to all the booksellers, because we're so grateful for all of you for putting books into kids' hands and helping us spread this message.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, and the amazing thing is that there is a hunger for this kind of book. Leslie, we had in your books, and I will admit that when we were ordering it, we were like, oh, that feels a little narrow, and all the copies are claimed already. So so we're gonna have to order more.
So glad to hear.
So
Thank you.
I think that now is a great time for your books, and they're also wonderful. And I think that they speak to this topic, but not in isolation. I think that they're going to really sing forward to many readers. So I cannot recommend these books highly enough. Please order them and carry them. And I want to thank each of you for coming in and sharing with us. It's been really great talking to you.